Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. I'm Rebecca Fall, Program Manager for the Center for Renaissance Studies at the Newberry Library in Chicago, and I am thrilled to welcome y'all to our Race and Dialogue series today. This series aims to bring scholars across professional generations into conversation about the state of pre-modern critical race studies and critical Indigenous studies. Today's dialogue features the brilliant Professor Ayanna Thompson in conversation with the mind-blowing Professor Noémie Ndiaye. Before we dig into today's program, I will read the Newberry's Land Acknowledgement. As part of our commitment to addressing the ongoing legacies of dispossession and settler colonialism, as well as our relationships with the city, the land, and the environment, the Newberry Library has crafted this acknowledgement in partnership with the Chicago American Indian Center. Located near the confluence of several waterways, the Newberry Library sits on land that intersects with the Aboriginal homelands of several tribal nations: the Council of the Three Fires, the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe nations, the Illinois Confederacy, the Peoria and Kaskaskia nations, and the Miamia, Wea, Fakiwaki, and Meskwaki nations. The Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Kickapoo, and Mascoutin nations also call the region of Northeast Illinois home. Indigenous people continue to live in this area and celebrate their traditional teachings and lifeways. Today, Chicago is home to one of the largest urban Indigenous communities in the United States, and this land remains an important place for Indigenous peoples. As a Chicago institution, it is the Newberry's responsibility to acknowledge this historical context and build reciprocal relationships with the tribal nations on whose lands we are situated. And I'll just say, since this is a virtual event, you all, our panelists and our audience members, are joining us from many different places, and wherever you currently are, we encourage you to learn about how you may be of service to the people on whose land you're situated and seek to understand your place within the history that has brought you to reside there. Now, on to today's program. The Race and Dialogue series of conversations began in 2020 and will continue over the next years as we plan an exhibition devoted to race in the pre-modern world in collaboration with in conjunction with the Race Before Race conference at the University of Chicago in 2023. Thanks go to Ayanna Thompson, leader of the Race Before Race project, with whom we've partnered for the exhibition, as well as Noémie Ndiaye, who is co-curating the exhibition and who has also helped organize this series. The exhibition project, entitled Seeing Race Before Race, involves an interdisciplinary group of scholars and graduate students throughout the US and abroad who are contributing relating to related programming and a publication. The publication, which Professor Ndiaye is also co-editing. Both of today's speakers are in that group of scholars. We are thrilled to have Professors Thompson and Ndiaye with us today, not least because we love their work and we've been collaborating them, but also because they're both path-making specialists in early modern drama and pre-modern critical race studies. They are reshaping the field in incredibly inspiring ways. That reshaping includes Professor Ndiaye's book, Scripts of Blackness, Early Modern Performance Culture and the Making of a Race, forthcoming this summer or later this year from the University of Pennsylvania Press. So keep an eye out, it's a game changer. Now, rather than provide a formal introduction for each of today's discussants, they will briefly introduce themselves through this conversation about creating and building on the field of pre-modern critical race studies. We will also link to their faculty pages in the chat. If you have questions at any time during today's program, please write them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any time, and we will collect them and get to have the speakers address them as best that they're able towards the end of the program. Now, Professor Ndiaye, Professor Thompson, thank you so much for being here, and I will now pass the mic over to Professor.
Thank you for those lovely introductions, Becky. I'm delighted to be here. My name is Noémie Ndiaye, and I will introduce Professor Thompson, who is extremely modest. So I promised that I would keep this bio brief, but I can't help it.
Very brief.
Okay. Ayanna Thompson is a Regents Professor of English at Arizona State University, where she directs the Arizona Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies, which is currently changing the game in early modern studies in the US. As the director of ACMRS, her primary goal is to develop the foundation for diverse and inclusive futures in pre-modern studies. And I cannot emphasize those keywords enough: inclusive, diverse. And this is why she created the Race Before Race Symposium series, which you already heard about. She is an extremely prolific author. She is the author of Performing Race and Torture on the Early Modern Stage, which was published in 2008 by Routledge, Passing Strange, Shakespeare, Race and Contemporary America, Oxford, 2011. Shakespeare in the Theater, Peter Sellers, which was published by Arden in 2018, as well as her most recent work, this lovely Blackface book, which was published by Bloomsbury in 2021. And those are just her monographs. She's also co-written Teaching Shakespeare with Purpose, a student-centered approach, co-written with Laura Turchi. And that was published, let me see, by Arden in 2016. She has edited Colorblind Shakespeare, New Perspectives on Race and Performance. That was Routledge 2006. She has co-edited with Scott Mustock, Wayward Macbeth, Intersections of Race and Performance, Palgrave Macmillan in 2010. And she has written the introduction to the new Arden 4 edition of Othello. It's a very long introduction. It's over 100 pages, and it's just brilliant and illuminating in every way. 2016 with Arden. So these are just her publications, right? In addition to
you
that,
missed the Cambridge book.
You know what? Okay,
I'm just teasing. Let's end it there because now I'm totally embarrassed.
Absolutely. The Cambridge Companion to Shakespeare and Race, which is absolutely amazing. And I think I probably didn't mention that because I have an essay in it.
I was going to say, let's move on. Noémie, yes. You're amazing and generous.
She was the president of the Shakespeare Association of America in 2018, 2019. And last year, she was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She is one of the founding voices in pre-modern critical race studies. Few people are doing as much for the field as she has and keeps doing. We are not worthy. And I'm just delighted to have this opportunity to basically ask Ayanna all the questions I ever wanted to ask. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. That's such a generous introduction. And of course, I'm like the least generous person to receive it because I'm just like, but thank you. And it's such an honor to be in dialogue with you because I feel like you're like the real deal and I'm the fake deal because I'm not trained in our field. And so I'm like, oh, Noémie knows all the historical stuff in multiple languages and I barely know contemporary stuff in English. So I feel quite humbled when I'm speaking to you about the field.
I'm so happy that this conversation is happening. So I have a bunch of questions for you, Ayanna, and because we have only 30 minutes and then I have to yield the floor, open it up to questions from our viewers. I'm just going to get started. And my first question is about your fight, right? It's about your beliefs, your convictions, everything you're fighting for intellectually in this field. You are preoccupied with the many manifestations of what I identify as cultural oblivion around the relation between Shakespeare and race. And there are several occurrences in your work. For instance, in Wayward Macbeth, there's this moment when you tell us that this play has been central to American racial formations forever, and we just keep forgetting and we just keep reinventing the wheel, right? I'm just going to quote you very quickly. Wayward Macbeth positions the Scottish play in the center of American racial constructions. Shakespeareans alone cannot tell this eclectic story. We need Americanists, filmmakers, musicians, musicologists, actors, directors, film theorists, and artists to tell a tale that signifies something about Macbeth, race, and the American imagination from as many viewpoints as possible. The motif of cultural oblivion also pops up in Passing Strange, where you make the case, you show us very clearly that multicultural Shakespeare theater companies tend to tell their customers, their spectators, that they're always doing something new when really they're not. This tradition goes way back. And on various occasions, you have insisted that we need to stop framing Black Shakespeareans. You're talking about actors, but I think this applies to scholars as well. We need to stop framing Black Shakespeareans as the first, because most of the time they're not. And when we do that, we are losing rich critical genealogies. So I do get the sense that for you, cultural oblivion is actually a major risk that PCRS is facing right now, besides white supremacy. But this is a really important issue, and I would love to hear more from you about that.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think it is one of the handmaidens of white supremacy is to have this historical amnesia, or as you call it, cultural oblivion. And I think when I was joking before that I'm so honored to be in conversation with you, someone who has been so thoroughly trained in our field, I was trained in African American studies and post-colonial studies. So I do feel like I'm very attentive to historical amnesia, because so if we just think about African American theater, like we had this vibrant theater in the early 19th century. We had a really vibrant theater during the Harlem Renaissance. We had a really vibrant theater in the Black arts movement. And so we're now at this moment where people are like, the first, and I'm like, it's just because either you refuse to learn our shared history, or you are willfully forgetting all of our ancestors who have fought these fights before. I'm terrified that like I will have moved the dial ever so slightly, and that it'll just go back and we will all have forgotten. I mean, that's probably the thing that like keeps me on the hamster wheel the most, is that, I believe that real change can happen, and that we can have different conversations, that we can have more complex conversations around race, gender, ability, class, oral quality on stage. But it won't be the first time we were having these conversations. I just think that is one of the things that scares me the most.
No, absolutely. And this is very resonant with, I'm thinking about Margot Hendricks' definition of pre-modern critical race studies versus pre-modern race studies, which has everything to do with acknowledging critical genealogies, right? Not reinventing the wheel of the time. Every time we have those conversations. And also Kim Hall, who in a brilliant interview that will be in the forthcoming Race Before Race volume that I'm co-editing, is making this case that it also is a way in this cultural amnesia, this historical amnesia or cultural oblivion. It's also a way of stemming the development of the field, because if people keep having the same conversations over and over again, then things don't move forward.
Precisely. I do think I'm thinking we've gotten to the moment where we no longer have to argue about historical anachronism. Like I felt like that was the tool that was wielded against Margot, Joyce, Kim, Ian, Arthur, me, like that we were doing something that was violating historical norms. And for me, I was like, okay. I'm not actually all that interested in that part. Like I'm interested in now. So, so I do think that like in terms of that fight, like I do feel like at least right now for this year or the last 5 years, we no longer have to retread that ground about why it's not anachronistic to talk about race. But let's see what happens in 20 years, right? Yeah, I mean, and that's where I am. You know me, I'm a very optimistic person. That's where I'm most pessimistic. Yeah.
Interesting. And so you mentioned I'm moving on to my second question, but a beautiful segue I see is that the theatrical culture, the moments of Black theatrical culture that were particularly vibrant that you just mentioned, something they have in common is that they're always engaging with Shakespeare, right?
Always.
And so, And that's the medium. So this is what I wanted to ask you about in Passing Strange, your second monograph. You went in a new direction. It was actually not entirely new. The questions were already present at the end of your first monograph, but you shifted archives. We'll get back to that. But in Passing Strange, you highlight beautifully, clearly the difference between the kind of work you started doing and you proposed in that moment, and which is focused on 20th and 21st century takes on Shakespearean legacy, although of course you do work on the 19th century versions of that as well. And you distinguish that focus from other foci in pre-modern critical race studies. So again, I'm going to quote you. Okay, think, for example, about the numerous excellent books that historicize race in the early modern period. Eldred Jones, Anthony Barthélemy, Anya Lumba, Kim Hall, Joyce Green MacDonald. As excellent, informative, and necessary as these works are, they do not encourage one to engage in the cultural work Renaissance texts perform in the 21st century. While they combat simplistic espousals of Shakespeare's universality by investigating the particulars of Renaissance culture, they do not engage in contemporary notions of the universal. So there is a way in which a turn towards an investigation of Shakespeare and race in the 21st century is a version of new historicism, a version that takes on the current moment instead of a past one. And so this agenda that you set, in Passing Strange, it has really taken off. I can think of many junior scholars now who have followed in your footsteps, who are working on contemporary productions of Shakespeare and on adaptations of Shakespeare in various media, not limited to live theater. And so I guess my question is, how do you think about the coexistence of those two types of work in the current ecology of PCRS as it develops? And because I know that you are very interested in questions of pipeline, and how do we, train the next generation of PCRS scholars, how does the coexistence of both types of work inform the way you think about what should be graduate training for early modernists in 2022?
Yeah, well, obviously, I think both have to work fully, along with a bunch of other methodological approaches to race. Like, I just think that you can't just have one tool to analyze race, because it is so opportunistic, and white supremacy is so opportunistic that, like, if you don't have like every single tool available to you, it's easy for your work to be criticized, for it to be discounted, for it to be not cited, for all of the historical amnesia that we just talked about before. So I think it is incredibly important to have people who are working deep in the archives like you. And I think about Urvashi Chakravarti's amazing archival work. I think that's critical and vital, and I learn from scholars like you. But on the other hand, we have to have people who are working on contemporary film, theater, television, because there's just so much content being put out right now. A lot of it has Shakespearean roots, and a lot of it is completely unaware of how race works in those narratives, in those cultural narratives. So I think we absolutely need both. In terms of graduate training, I mean, I think this is where I'm probably like more old school. I'm like, you have to know twice as much as your white colleagues. I mean, I don't know twice as much, but like, I have educated myself, right? Like I've sought out all of that archive. But I do think it to land well in PCRS, to do that kind of work well, you have to know the full historical archive. You have to talk about like historical minutia fluently. And then you have to be able to pivot also into, and yet, do you know what happened last year in this film? Like, I do think that you need both of those in order to, I think, to be able to combat all of the obstacles that are in the way to talking about race. And because people, our white colleagues are so, and this is not an insult, it's just a fact, are so deeply uncomfortable talking about race. And when I say our white colleagues, I mean scholars, I mean practitioners. It's very, very uncomfortable. And so we just need people who are comfortable and fluid in all the ways that you can talk about race.
Yeah, I was just rereading Passing Strange in particular. I was struck and impressed by some of the skills that were required to conduct that time of research, which at times it requires some skills that you learn if you're a graduate student in social sciences, right? Not so much in English departments. So and making a fair assessment of what it requires, to do that innovative type of work, I think.
Yeah, and as I, so for those listening, I had the great good fortune to talk to Noémie's class last year about this incredible archive they're creating about Black Shakespearean practitioners. And I said, there are a bunch of social science skills that you need. And one is you have to do institutional review board training to work with human subjects. Like, this is not something that your normal Shakespearean has to deal with. Most of my graduate students I make get IRB training. And it's because if you want to work with living practitioners, you better do that in an ethical and moral framework.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to ask you about your archives, right? As I mentioned earlier, well, I didn't mention that, but I'm going to say it now. One thing that is striking to me is how profoundly different your 4 monographs are from one another. And at the same time, how neatly they connect. You can always tell that the seed of the next project is there, right? It's at the end. And so at the end of Performing Torture, you ask all those questions about trans-historical casting. What happens when you use blackface? What happens when you have actors of color? How do you work ethically? How does meaning making happen? All of those questions are there at the end of Performing Race and Torture. Even though the book was focused on restoration drama by some very little known playwrights such as Elkanah Settle. I love Elkanah Settle. No one ever teaches Elkanah Settle, right? And so you have those moments, those last couple of pages where you are you're advocating for a revival of those archives that receive little critical and artistic love, and you explain why, right? These plays, I'm citing you, expose the failure of their representation through the revelation of agency, and these revelations may combat the universalized and depoliticized treatment of many texts by more canonical early modern writers. You advocate for the re-edition of those texts, the dissemination of these plays in classrooms, and then at the end of the paragraph, you talk about the benefits of focusing on those archives. The benefits and the challenges, again, I'm quoting you, are that these plays have been neglected and thus rendered non-canonical, one need not battle years of performance history and convention to recover these plays. This is the most moving line, I think. When when you think about your entire arc, yet one must battle the notion that they are not worthy of recovery. Obviously, in the years following this book, you decided to wage that battle, right, against years of performance history and convention as they affect Shakespeare performance traditions, and you won. You waged that battle successfully. But I guess my question, so it's two-headed, right? 2 questions here inspired by this paragraph. The first one is, why live productions, right? What does the medium of live production do for you conceptually, intellectually, that just you cannot do based on solely dramatic textual archives? And then my follow-up question has to do with how hopeful you remain that those non-canonical plays are going to receive some attention.
Well, interestingly, because of course, the best thing one can do as a scholar is forget what you've written before. I forgot about that part of the book. But I am working with I can't name any names because it's not done yet, but I'm working with a very prominent BIPOC playwright who is thinking about doing a kind of retake of Southern's Orinoco. And so I think there is and part of what she didn't want to deal with Shakespeare. She's like, I don't want to do that. And so she's like, what else can I read? And I was like, oh, read this one and see what you think. And she just came by the other day and she was like, what? So I do think there is a way in which those plays have a lot for us to offer. And the reason that I think performance as opposed to just a read archive is so important is because there is something that happens, and this is the woo-woo part, but like there is something that happens collectively about cultural meaning making when you're in a room with a thousand or a couple of hundred other people. And either you're all responding together or you're, which is frequently me, the one person in the audience who has a completely different emotional response. Usually I'm like, wow, these white audiences, what are you doing? But I think there is something about getting a sense of how meaning is made culturally in that collective space that I actually believe in. Like, I really do believe in that. I love just teaching plays as pieces of literature or kind of an archive. But for me, the bigger thing is when it's up on its feet and not just on a screen either. And that's what's been so hard these past couple of years is not having live theater. So yes, and I think it's really interesting that you are noting that my books are different, because I think I've been worrying, like, am I just saying the same thing over and over again and no one's listening? So I appreciate that you see them as being as tackling different things.
I know, absolutely. And I mean, so your first book is articulating the key questions and that foundational definition of how race functions on stage and in early modernity, right? You're going back to, you're giving us an explanation for why race is simultaneously conceived of as essential and performative in contemporary American culture, right?
Yes.
This is the air that we breathe in. And you take us back to those archives to give us an origin story, so to speak. In Colorblind Shakespeare, you're examining this, we're changing scales entirely, right? Mm-hmm. You're looking at best casting practices and how to deal with meaning making in the context of racialized performance, profoundly different. Then your third book is the case study, right? Completely different scale. Peter Sellers, how does he do Shakespeare? And of course, you care about Peter Sellers because the way he does Shakespeare is he engages with the questions that are, that move you. So this might be what you feel like you're always doing the same thing, but no, you're writing
well, thanks.
different genres, scales, and archives. But actually, this might be a good segue to a question I wanted to ask you about the audience for your books, because I think that the audience has shifted over time. And I'm getting back to the keywords that I mentioned in your bio: diverse and inclusive, right? Your audience has shifted, it has grown inclusive. It's grown more and more inclusive over time. You are writing for scholars, you're also writing for activists, theater artists, high school teachers, and in your last book on Blackface, the general public. You actually make that clear, right? And you address the reader and you are working to make the style accessible. It's very palpable. You offer concrete pedagogical models in teaching Shakespeare with a purpose. You offer concrete models for doing casting thoughtfully in Passing Strange. And I will say, you don't shy away from the prescriptive mode, which is refreshing. And so my question is, those diverse readers, do they listen? And of course, I know that they listen, but I would like to hear about how they listen, right? If you could, leaving modesty aside for a second, tell us about the impact of your scholarly interventions among theater makers, teachers, and activists, and what is it like talking to those different audiences?
Yeah, so, the Performing Race and Torture book was my dissertation, except for wholly rewritten because it got trashed by reviewers, as it should have. It was like not a great dissertation. In fact, I make all my graduate students, when they're having anxiety about writing their dissertation, I give them a copy of mine and they're like, this is so bad. And I'm like, yeah, you can go on and have a good career and have a bad dissertation. So it's okay. But I don't think I knew, I think in the dissertation and the book that became, I think I was trying to imitate what I thought was a scholarly voice. And so the sentences are somewhat dense, and the hardest thing for me was my mother, who is an amazing woman and who's ABD from the University of Chicago in English. She was a classmate with Barbara Lewalski, who was one of my advisors at Harvard. So I have these like amazing literary mothers. But my mother said, like, she's like, this is a very interesting book. She goes, but it's hard for me to read it. I feel like I can only do a couple of pages at a time. And I thought, what's the point of me writing if someone as smart as my mother doesn't understand it? Like, impact is tiny then, right? Like, am I writing for 5 people? Will I feel fulfilled if that's what no. And that's probably why I'm at an institution like Arizona State University, where we want maximum impact, right? We don't want to be exclusive. We want to be inclusive and make sure everyone succeeds. And so my writing did very self-consciously change through the books to be more available, accessible to a wide range of audiences. I think the work on teaching Shakespeare has been very impactful. Of course, I can't take credit for that because my amazing co-author, Laura Turchi, who is trained in teacher education, there's nothing more pleasurable than writing that book with her. Such an amazing, smart person, and just to have like 2 brains writing a book was just so fun. So I think that's worked. And I would say the bigger surprise is that theater practitioners now are reading a lot of my work, which I had hoped would happen, but I wasn't sure because there really is a divide between scholars and practitioners around Shakespeare. And I'm just trying to, like a great colleague, Jim Shapiro, I'm trying to make sure that that divide doesn't persist and that we can talk to each other in ways that both understand. So that's been happening, much to my delight. In terms of, I think where I've not succeeded is activists. I'm not sure that my work has translated into that field as successfully as I would have liked. And I think that does impact some of the graduate students who've come to work with me, that part has not succeeded. I mean, except for activism in the field, yes. Right. Activism on a larger scale, no.
Oh, that's very interesting. We're going to talk about your activism in the field in a second, but I just, as supplementary information, I also wanted to point out this question of accessibility is something you're also trying actively to promote in the field. I'm thinking about the Sundial, right, which is the new journal that you created, but 3 years ago, 2 years ago?
Yeah, I think so. 3 years ago, I think. Yeah.
Right. Which is open access, promotes short form and accessible content precisely to do that kind of work. So in traditional Ayanna fashion, you're not just doing it yourself. You're trying to provide platforms for others to do that kind of work.
And can I put a plug in for the Sundial? Because as a publisher of an academic press right now, like I know how many copies we sell of a book, and like a really good book will sell like 500 to 1,000 copies for an academic press. Our lowest read piece on the Sundial trumps that. So it just feels like, if you want to reach people, then you have to write in ways, both media and formats and rhetorically, that they will accept. And so that has been, very important for me.
Right, absolutely. And I believe that actually right behind you is one of the latest volumes of ACMRS Press.
Yes. So this is the new publication from ACMRS Press, edited by Carol Mejia LaPearl, Race and Affect in Early Modern English Literature. It's a fantastic book. It is free. It is absolutely free, open access on our website, or you can buy a paperback, or you can buy a hardback, and they're both in very, very affordable price ranges. So yes, that is part of the mission for me as a person. And it's been really gratifying to have a research center and a press that I can push in that direction, right? So to aim for maximum impact.
Mm-hmm. And all those things connect, right? I'm thinking that a volume such as this one, which is bringing together the encounter of PCRS and affect theory, it's kind of new, right? It's pretty opening new directions. Open access, which means that teachers, right, whom you are writing for and talking to can actually use that and repurpose excerpts in their syllabi. So cohesive vision. Okay. We're running out of time, but I still want to take 5 minutes to talk a little bit about your activism in the field, academic activism. And I titled that question, Ayanna's Institutions, because the Newberry Library titled the session, Ayanna Thompson, A Career in PCRS. I want to talk about your institutional work. You are, as I mentioned earlier, former president of the Shakespeare Association of America. You are the founder of Race Before Race and the director of ACMRS, which is growing and taking flight right now in really impressive ways. And I want to say that tell me if I'm wrong, but my impression is that in our field of pre-modern critical race studies, you do find a bunch of colleagues who are a little bit dubious or distrustful of the good that institutions can do. Mm-hmm. And part of this has, of course, roots in critical race theories and the more pessimist streams of critical race theory, which
and abolitionist theory. Yeah, I think a lot of the colleagues that I admire, they come from an abolitionist stance, which means that they're not going to work with the institution because their whole stance is to not destroy, but to dismantle the institution and build something else, right?
Exactly. And so I guess my question, you are the person who can really answer that question. What does it mean for you to do good for this field, to build this field through institutional work? Mm-hmm. And what does it take also to be an institutional builder in PCRS?
Yeah. So I think there's two important parts of my personality. One is that I'm an all-in person. For me to do something, like I actually have to really believe in it, believe that I can make it better, or believe that I can have some sort of impact. I don't like to be at institutions where I don't feel like I'm all in. I have left institutions, private institutions, because I couldn't believe in the mission. So that's just a part of how I'm wired. I want to be always all in. And the second part about my personality that I've only come to learn fairly recently is that I love seeing how sausage gets made. So I'm on a bunch of boards now, and it's like my favorite thing in the world. I like looking at spreadsheets for money. I like seeing how institutions are organized. I'm just one of those systems people. And so I get pleasure from learning how systems work and learning what happens if you change which parts of the system and how can you get what you want to be more inclusive, diverse, whatever it is that your goal is, what levers do you have to pull? So I just find that incredibly pleasurable. So I think, as I said, my colleagues who I love and admire, who are more on the abolitionist streak, I think it's not only their kind of ethical and moral stances. I actually think their personalities are different in that they don't find pleasure in learning how systems work, and they don't feel like they have to be all in. They often feel like their best work is when they're in direct opposition. I get that. I totally respect that. That's just not how I am. I would feel very, very unsatisfied if I felt like I was in direct opposition all the time.
And what, I can think of a lot of examples, but what change have you been able to work through, achieve through your institutional work, either Race Before Race or SAA, or, what are you proudest of?
Oh my gosh.
Most meaningful for you?
Yeah, right now I'm proudest of the hires that we've done at Arizona State University, the Constellation hire that we did a year ago with 5 BIPOC early modernists joining our already robust early modernists at ASU. In 1 year, we went from being a very good program to being, I think, one of the best in the country. And so that, I think I am proudest of that. And we'll be hiring some postdocs soon who I think will have the opportunity to convert their lines to track lines if they like. So it does feel like that to me. There was this amazing moment when Trish Matthews, our great 18th century colleague, was on the Roxane Gay podcast, and she was talking about what it takes to get institutions to change. And she's like, tenured lines. And that's exactly right, because if you don't have that, you don't have the people who are voting all the time. Now, I mean, there's lots of people who would, say like what we need to do is get rid of tenure, and that's another argument. But I do think in this current structure, you just got to throw a lot of different voices in there. More women, women of color, trans activists, non-binary scholars, disabled scholars, like we have to have our whole coalition in those department meetings to fight back against the backsliding white supremacy that we face daily. So
beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for this. I just keep learning from you. I've been lucky enough to be on the board of Race Before Race for the last couple of years. And I really feel like this is an education in systems, right? And I keep learning. Thank you for all those avenues you're creating for us all to learn together.
Thank you also for all the labor you do. I mean, you are doing a lot of labor, and it's not self-serving labor. And I think that's often invisible to people. So I just want to highlight that about you, Noémie.
Well, thank you. And all the board members.
Well, yes, that whole board is amazing.
So I think it's time for us to actually open the floor and look at questions that have been asked by some of our attendees. So we have one question. Okay, let's start with Jennifer Waldron's question.
Hey, Jen.
Jen says, thank you both for this brilliant discussion. Ayanna, I'm thinking back to the wonderful talk you gave about Othello at Pitt some time ago. Can you say more about how your ideas/feelings have evolved about that play's critical genealogies, especially in light of your new art and introduction, which I just ordered?
Oh, thanks, Jen. Yes, I was pregnant with my daughter at the time I gave that visit, so I know exactly when that was. So that was probably like 2009. So I think I think my dislike of that play has solidified. Like I just not in terms of teaching it, not in terms of talking about it, not in terms of thinking about the performance history, but I actually don't want to see any more productions for a while. And it's really, really hard. I know it's like a radical stance that gets people's hackles up, but it's a damaging production. And I think for actors of color to do it well, there's a lot of personal harm that goes along with it. So I think that's something that is hard for people to talk about, but is very real. Jim Shapiro and I just did a really great event at the 92nd Street Y with John Douglas Thompson, Chakwudi Uji, and Andre Holland. And those three amazing Black actors have very different takes on Othello in performance, but it did get to some deep places when we had that conversation. So yeah, I think maybe I'm like even more against that play in production now.
That's so interesting. If I may just piggyback very, very quickly, I saw a production in the fall of Othello at the Court Theater here in Chicago. And it was co-directed by Charlie Newell and Gabrielle Rendell-Bent, who is amazing and is featured on the Black Shakespeare Database. And there were many things they did. I think one of your graduate students actually flew in to see that performance. There were many things they did that were interesting, like having a Black Cassio and, what kind of meaning making does that produce? But at the end of the day, I did feel that the core of it, this Othello plotline, it's just immovable. It's there. I thought that the Othello plotline was the least interesting part of the production.
That's exactly right. And I think that's exactly it. Like to have a really good progressive production, like as you say, the Othello core of it will be the least involved in that part. Like you just have to do a lot of like world making around it, which can be interesting. But I just think why don't we invest our time and resources into something else on the stage? This is not about teaching. It's not about reading. It's not about like, I love the poetry of the play. It's just about what I see on that stage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wonderful. We have another question from the Chicago Shakespeare Theater, Zoom room 3.
Hey, Chicago Shakes.
At Chicago Shakespeare, we recently held a 3-part teacher workshop focused on teaching Shakespeare in an anti-racist classroom, brilliantly and empathetically guided by Vanessa Corredera. Yes. Among the 90 teachers who participated, there were several who revealed in their evaluations that they are in schools and districts where this work is dangerous.
Yes.
Any advice for them?
Yes, I think that is the new obstacle that we're all facing. If historical amnesia or cultural oblivion is one of the things I fear, this is probably the more direct tool, is that, like, how do we get people to forget? You're not allowed to talk about it, right? Okay. So I think one of the strategies is to ask questions of the text with your students that allows them to bring it into the classroom. So if your district or your state says that you're not allowed to bring critical race studies into the classroom, there are ways in which the students will bring it anyway. And I just think the types of questions or the types of doors you open up, the types of close reading exercises that you do with them, the types of embodied performance approaches that you allow in the classroom will engage the students or enable the students to go in those directions so they can bring it up. And I'm very heartened by Generation Z. I think they are ready to engage in very fresh ways. So I think that those are a couple of strategies.
Thank you. We have a question from Becky. This was so great, Ayanna. I love your insights about having the personality for doing certain types of work. I am also an all-in person, and I find pleasure in seeing how the sausage gets made. I'm curious, how do you think that your interest in that work and your expertise in institutional mechanics intersects with or influences your scholarship? Thank you.
Oof, that's a good question. I'm not sure if I think it influences my activism or the work that I'm doing behind the scenes. So for example, I'm a really, everyone knows this who's close to me, I'm a really good negotiator because I was an associate dean of faculty, and I learned what these white men were asking for and getting. And so I was like, what? This is blowing my mind. We're not asking. So like, I do feel like the advice, and I share this knowledge with everyone who asks me one-on-one, including Noémie, including lots of people. So I do feel like that kind of systems knowledge I use more often when I'm mentoring or advising or teaching. I'd be hard pressed to think about it in my scholarship, although one of the things I can reveal about myself is that since like the horrors of writing my dissertation, which was like, I don't know, it was so painful. It was so painful. I decided I didn't want to feel pain around writing. And so I am a very, I don't think it has to be perfect. I think it has to be smart. You have to have something to say, but it doesn't need to be like perfect prose. So I don't agonize over writing. So maybe that's systems thinking. I'm not sure. I don't know.
I think your scholarship is all about systems. I mean, in Passing Strange, you're analyzing a system of casting.
Yeah, that's true.
And it's so profoundly, I mean, you are one of the greatest advocates for the use of critical race theory in our field, right? You're giving us regular reminders, which is all about systemic thinking.
No, you're right. I guess I just hadn't thought about it that way. I guess I compartmentalize like all the boards that I'm on, or like, I'm chairing a dean search right now, like that stuff. I compartmentalize as different than my scholarship. But you're right. A lot of my scholarship is precisely interested in the system. So like, for example, with Peter Sellers, there's a whole other book. I put this out into the universe. There's a whole other book about just his years leading the National Theater, the only national theater that we've ever had in the US. He led it for 2 years. There's the Kennedy Center has a lot of that archive. I got some of it, but there's another book there, which is really, really interesting. So like, you're right. I think I am interested in like why that didn't work, why we've never had another national theater. what a national theater actually is. Like, how would we do that in the US as opposed to, you know, the UK or Ireland or, you know, so.
Right. Well, this is a very nice transition to a question I wanted to ask you. And while our viewers are collecting their thoughts and asking more questions, I'm just going to ask you about your next project, right? You've done so much, you've written so much. What now? What is left for you to do? What do you want to do? What is the next project and what are you working on?
Well, I'm not working on anything at the moment because I'm either in the rehearsal room in New York or administering stuff at Arizona State University. So I have a couple of nights where like I cry over a glass of wine, like, will I ever write again? But I do have another book idea. I have two book ideas. One I've had for my whole life, and I think I probably won't write it because maybe it's something I want to fantasize about instead of actually writing, which is about revenge. Like I teach courses on revenge tragedies. I love revenge tragedies. I find them so like interesting and satisfying and bloodlusty, you know. So there's that'll probably never get done. But I'm interested, and also the way that race works in those tales is very interesting, race and gender. But probably if I do another book, it'll probably be the book that I've talked about a little bit about virtuosity and acting, and thinking cross-historically about how race complicates a lot of the narratives that we tell about how virtuosity gets coded. And I think it has to do with how white actors are encouraged to be mutable and to put on, to apply blackface or to be a different gender or whatever, and that door is not necessarily as open to actors of color, and what that means about how we describe virtuosity for both sets. If I get to do this book, it'll be a miracle because I think about it, but I don't know that I have the time to do it.
Are there some actors you have in mind that you want to write on in this book?
Oh yeah. I'm really interested. I talked a little bit, I gave a talk at the RSA last year. And one of the little bits that I mentioned is the way that Tilda Swinton is described is fascinating to me, and it's all wrapped up with her whiteness. And they always talk about her being protean and changeable and mutable, and the actor that you can't necessarily put your finger on whenever she's on the screen. And then I think about actors of color who have been who are the most lauded and how they're never described in those terms. Like Denzel Washington is frequently put at the top of lists of actors, but no one would ever call him mutable or protean, and nor would I. And so then I'm questioning why that's my stance, or what he's been allowed to do or chosen to do, both, I imagine. So anyway, there's something there. I don't know if I'll get to it. So if someone else writes it before me, I will happily read it.
There is enthusiasm. There's a lot of enthusiasm about this book in the chat, if you have the occasion to check. And by the way, we didn't mention that in your bio, but I believe that you're currently working. I mean, would you want to tell us just which artists you're working with right now?
Yeah, so I have had the great good fortune of working on the Broadway production of Macbeth, which goes into previews on Monday. So with Daniel Craig and Ruth Negga and Asia Kate Dillon, Amber Gray, Paul Lazar. It's an unbelievable cast, and a very, very thoughtful production directed by Sam Gold, very intentionally cast with regards to race. I would say it's a production about purging us of toxic white masculinity in the form of James Bond, who is a lovely, and Daniel's just like a really, really lovely person. So I've been working on that randomly, not randomly. I am also working on a musical. I don't do musicals. I don't know much about musicals, but at the Public Theater, an amazing musical about the suffrage movement. So between 1913 and 1920. And it is also very intentionally cast with actors of color and non-binary actors and trans actors. And so I was brought on to help make meaning, how to use the bodies on the stage, and how to signal to the audience what we're doing with those bodies. And so that's been a real joy, and that's already opening. It's in previews already, and opening night is April 6th. So reviews will start coming in this next week, I think. So
that's amazing. So exciting. I can't believe, I don't know how you managed to do it all, but you are a phenomenon, and you are so busy that we're really grateful that you took the time for this conversation. I received a message that here would be a good time and place to wrap up. Okay. So I'm going to.
And let me just say what a pleasure it is to talk to you, Noémie. I'm so honored that you went back through my books like that. As I said, like, I'm so used to thinking that people don't read them. And I would say for most of my career, I did feel like no one was reading or citing my work. And I was like, well, at least I know that I'm answering questions that I need to ask and answer. And I was thinking it might not ever reach anybody else. So I am really, really touched and honored that you went back through them. So thank you.
Those are classics. They've been on my shelf since graduate school. I actually started graduate school in 2011, which is right after you started publishing. So I'm the generation that read. Sure.
See, and this is proving that each new generation is better. So
thank you so much, Ayanna, for taking the time. And Becky, I'm going to let you swoop in.
Thank you both so much. A little coughing there. I see that we had a couple of questions that came in right as Professor Ndiaye started to wrap up, but we have recorded them and we'll send them along to our speakers for today, and hopefully we can get them answered. I'm sorry that we're not able to hear. That was just great. I feel so energized and excited having listened to you both speak and learned so much. I want to thank you, Ayanna, for all you do, for offering these insights, for taking the time amid your very busy schedule to be doing this. And same with you, Noémie. And I also, Noémie, you've done two of these for us now, and you are a really good discussant. You shape a conversation really well. Just gonna say that. But I want to say thank you to everyone else for joining us today. A recording of this program will be available on the Center for Renaissance Studies YouTube in the next few days, which I will link to here in the chat. And we also want to invite you all to join us for our next Race and Dialogue session, the final one for this academic year, with Taryn Andrews and Phil Deloria on topics in critical Indigenous studies on May 13th, 2022. So we really hope that we'll see you there. And have a good one, everyone. Happy springtime. Stay safe, and we appreciate you coming.